Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of line. We have some concerns about your documentation that we're going to need to resolve in secondary screening. TSA Officer Brandon Whitaker delivered the line at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning at the Terminal C Priority Security Checkpoint of Newark Liberty International Airport, in the unmistakable tone of a young officer who had been waiting for the right moment in his shift to exercise the discretion his job afforded him. The woman he was speaking to, Ambassador Nosy Adichie Brennan, 54 years old, permanent representative of the Republic of Canary to the United Nations, was wearing a charcoal gray Acre suit she had been given by her late mother as a graduation gift from Harvard Law School 26 years earlier, and that she had been wearing on diplomatic travel days ever since. She was holding in her right hand the dark blue United Nations laissez-passer that served as her primary travel document, and in her left hand the burgundy diplomatic passport of the Republic of Canary, which had been issued to her by her own Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and which bore, in the center of its embossed cover, the seal of a sovereign nation that maintained full diplomatic relations with the United States of America, and had done so since 1962. She had presented both documents to Officer Whitaker 46 seconds earlier. He had handed back the UN laissez-passer with the small, careful gesture of a man who did not know what it was. He had held the Canary diplomatic passport for the previous 23 seconds, turning it slowly in his hands, examining the seal, examining the photograph, examining the name. He had looked up at the woman in front of him. He had asked her to step out of line. The other passengers in the priority line, a thin crowd at 6:47 a.m. in mid-October, 6 or 7 business travelers, 2 diplomats from a different mission, Ambassador Adichie Brennan, did not personally know but recognized from various UN receptions, did not at first register what was happening. They registered instead the small, almost imperceptible tightening of the ambassador's posture, the way her chief of staff, a 38-year-old Canary national named Tunde Okeke, who had been walking 3 paces behind her with her briefcase, stopped walking, and the way one of the 2 diplomats from the other mission, a man in his 60s whom the ambassador recognized as the deputy chief of mission for a small West African delegation, turned his head approximately 15 degrees to track what was unfolding. 3 feet to his right, Ambassador Ngozi Adichie Brennan looked at Officer Brandon Whitaker for a long moment. She did not, in that moment, give him the courtesy of pretending to be confused. She gave him, instead, the exact tone of voice she had used in her 6 years as Foreign Minister of the Republic of Canary before her appointment to the UN, on the 3 separate occasions on which she had needed to communicate to a counterpart that he had badly misjudged the room he was standing in. Officer Whitaker, my documents are in order. The laissez-passer you have just returned to me is issued under Article 105 of the United Nations Charter and the 1947 Convention on the Privileges and Immunities of the United Nations, both of which the United States has ratified. The diplomatic passport you are currently holding is issued by a sovereign government with which your country maintains diplomatic relations. I am traveling this morning to Geneva to chair an emergency session of the Human Rights Council that begins at 3 this afternoon, local time. I would like you to return my passport. I would like you to allow me to proceed to my gate. If you have concerns about the documents, I would like you to summon your supervisor, who I expect will be able to resolve those concerns in under 3 minutes. Will you please do that for me? Officer Brandon Whitaker did not return the passport. He did not summon his supervisor. He told Ambassador Adichie Brennan that she would need to accompany him to secondary screening. He gestured with the hand not holding her passport toward a corridor behind the checkpoint. Tunde Okeke, standing 3 paces behind her, had already taken out his phone. He was, at that moment, sending the first of what would become a sequence of 31 text messages over the next 122 minutes to the Republic of Canary's Deputy Permanent Representative at the UN, to the U.S. State Department's Office of Foreign Missions Duty Officer, to the legal advisor of the Republic of Canary's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Canary City, and to the Secretary General of the President of the Republic of Canary. The first message read, Madam Ambassador detained by TSA Newark Terminal C, documents confiscated. Officer Whitaker badge 4719. Please advise. Ambassador Ngozi Adichie Brennan did not in the moment look back at Tunde Okeke. She did not need to. She knew, with the unambiguous clarity of a woman who had been a diplomat for 19 years, that the next 2 hours were no longer about her travel plans. They were about something else. She turned to Officer Whitaker. She inclined her head slightly in the precise diplomatic gesture that signaled neither agreement nor refusal, but acknowledgement of the situation she was now obligated to manage. She said in the same level voice, "Officer Whitaker, I will accompany you to secondary screening. I would like the time to be noted. It is now 6:48 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. My flight to Geneva departs at 8:15. I expect to be on it." Officer Brandon Whitaker did not at that moment register the implications of the precision with which the time had been recorded. He did not at that moment know that the Deputy Chief of Mission of the West African delegation standing 6 feet behind him had just done the same thing on his own watch with the same precision, for reasons he would explain to the Office of Foreign Missions duty officer in a phone call he would place at 7:03 a.m. He did not at that moment know that the legal advisor of the Republic of Canary's Ministry of Foreign Affairs was at that moment sitting at her desk in Canary City, where it was approximately 1:48 p.m., and that she had just received Tunde Okeke's first text message and was at that moment walking down the hallway to the office of the foreign minister. He did not, at that moment, know that the chain of events he had just initiated by gesturing toward a corridor behind a security checkpoint at Newark Liberty International Airport on a Tuesday morning in October would, within 72 hours, result in the formal summoning of the United States ambassador to the Republic of Canary to receive a démarche from the Canary foreign minister, the public release of a State Department statement of regret, the firing of 2 TSA officers, the resignation of the federal security director for Newark Liberty International Airport, and a closed-door briefing of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations by the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs on what the prepared briefing materials would describe as a serious diplomatic incident with implications for U.S. relations with the broader West African region. Officer Brandon Whitaker did not, at that moment, know any of these things. He knew only that he was about to escort a black woman in a charcoal gray suit to secondary screening because, in the assessment of his 32-year-old understanding of his duties as a TSA officer, her documents looked off. Ambassador Nosy Adichie Brennan had been permanent representative of the Republic of Canary to the United Nations for 4 years and 2 months. She was the third permanent representative her country had ever sent to New York, and the first woman. She had been born in 1971 in Canary City, the second of 4 daughters of a country court judge and a primary school headmistress. She had earned her undergraduate degree at Oxford on the first Canary government scholarship awarded to a woman in her country's history, where she had read philosophy, politics, and economics, and had graduated with a first in 1993. She had earned a master's in international relations at the London School of Economics in 1995. She had earned a JD at Harvard Law in 1999. She had served as Canary's ambassador to the European Union from 2014 to 2017, as Deputy Foreign Minister from 2017 to 2019, and as Foreign Minister of the Republic of Canary from 2019 to 2021. She had been appointed permanent representative to the United Nations in the autumn of her country's most recent presidential transition. She was, in the assessment of the U.S. State Department's career professionals who tracked Canary foreign policy, the most experienced, most credentialed, and most consequential diplomat her country had ever produced. She was also, in the assessment of those same professionals, on a credible path to becoming the next Secretary General of the United Nations within the next decade. She had a personal security detail of 2 retired Canary military officers who were, at the moment of her detention at Newark Liberty International Airport, traveling on a separate ticketed itinerary on a later flight and were therefore not present in the secondary screening room. Their travel had been arranged by the Republic of Canary Mission's Chief of Protocol on the basis of standard practice for ambassadors traveling on diplomatic passports to Geneva for routine UN business, which the trip on the morning of October 14 had been classified as until the moment Officer Brandon Whitaker had asked Ambassador Adichie Brennan to step out of line. Brandon Whitaker was 32 years old, white, 6'1", 215 pounds, and had been a TSA officer at Newark Liberty International Airport for 7 years. He had grown up in Toms River, New Jersey, the son of a retired plumber and a school cafeteria manager. He had spent 2 semesters at Ocean County College before dropping out. He had been hired by the TSA in his second application cycle. He had completed the TSA's Basic Security Officer Training Program. He had spent the entirety of his TSA career at Newark, primarily in Terminal C, and primarily on the morning shift. He had, in his 7 years on the job, accumulated 4 formal complaints in his personnel file, 2 for unprofessional language, 1 for an inappropriate comment to a female passenger, and 1 for what his supervisor had characterized as excessive use of secondary screening referrals against passengers presenting non-standard travel documentation. The last complaint, which had been filed 3 months earlier by the Egyptian mission to the United Nations after an incident involving a junior Egyptian diplomat traveling on a diplomatic passport, had been resolved with a verbal counseling. The Federal Security Director's Office had not, in its closure of the complaint, examined the broader pattern of Officer Whitaker's secondary screening referrals over the previous 3 years, which would have shown that approximately 73% of his referrals had been directed at passengers traveling on diplomatic passports from African, Middle Eastern, South Asian, or Caribbean countries, a referral rate approximately 5 times higher than the comparable rate of the other officers on his shift. He had been, by every visible indication available to him on the morning of October 14, comfortable in the assumption that the various small exercises of discretion that constituted the daily texture of his job were his alone to make. He had not, until that morning, encountered an ambassador. The secondary screening room was a small white-walled space approximately 12 feet by 15 feet, located off the corridor behind the Terminal C priority checkpoint, furnished with a metal table, 4 metal chairs, a security camera mounted in the corner near the ceiling, and a single white phone on the wall connected to the supervisor's office 1 floor up. Officer Whitaker brought Ambassador Adichie Brennan into the room at 6:51 a.m. He gestured for her to sit. He did not sit himself. He placed her diplomatic passport on the metal table. He placed the UN laissez-passer beside it. He told her that he was going to need to verify her identity. He told her that the verification process could take a little while. He did not specify how long. Ambassador Adichie Brennan did not sit. She remained standing, with her hands folded in front of her at the level of her waist, and she watched Officer Whitaker with an expression that the security camera mounted in the corner near the ceiling would later capture in 11 separate frames. As the expression of a senior diplomat preparing to escalate, she said in the same level voice she had used at the checkpoint, "Officer Whitaker, I will not be sitting. I have asked you twice to summon your supervisor. I am asking you a 3rd time. If you do not summon your supervisor within the next 60 seconds, I will instruct my chief of staff, who is currently standing in the corridor outside this room, to contact the United States Department of State's Office of Foreign Missions directly. The Office of Foreign Missions duty officer will, within 10 minutes, contact the Federal Security Director for Newark Liberty International Airport. The Federal Security Director will, within an additional 10 minutes, be standing in this room. I would prefer not to involve the Department of State at this hour of the morning. Whether I do so is a function of whether you pick up that phone on the wall in the next 60 seconds. Officer Whitaker, the clock has started." Brandon Whitaker did not, at that moment, pick up the phone. He did not, for reasons he would later be unable to explain to the federal investigators who interviewed him under oath 3 weeks later, take the ambassador's statement seriously. He believed, he would later say, in the careful phrasing of a man who had been coached by an attorney, that she was attempting to talk her way out of secondary screening. He had encountered, in his 7 years on the job, perhaps 80 or 90 passengers who had attempted to talk their way out of secondary screening. None of them had, in his recollection, actually had the standing to do so. He told her that he would summon his supervisor when he was ready. He told her that she would sit down. He told her that she would wait. She did not sit down. In the corridor outside the secondary screening room, Tunde Okeke had been making phone calls for the previous 6 minutes. He had reached, in order, the deputy permanent representative of the Republic of Canary at the UN in New York, who had immediately begun calling the Office of Foreign Missions duty officer, the legal advisor of the Canary Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Canary City, who had immediately walked into the office of the foreign minister, the foreign minister himself, who had immediately taken a meeting with the chief of staff to the president of the Republic of Canary, the chief of protocol of the Republic of Canary Permanent Mission in New York, who had immediately notified the State Department's African Affairs duty officer, and the personal cell phone of the United States ambassador to the United Nations, whom Tunde Okeke had met twice at receptions and with whom he had exchanged numbers in case of exactly this kind of situation. The U.S. ambassador to the UN, a former senator named Patricia Greenfield, who was at that moment having breakfast at her residence at the Waldorf Towers, had picked up on the second ring. She had listened to Tunde Okeke for 47 seconds. She had said, in a tone that Tunde Okeke would later describe to his colleagues as the voice of a woman who has woken up in the middle of a story she will be telling for the rest of her career, that she would call the State Department Operations Center personally within the next 2 minutes and that she would call Tunde Okeke back within 15. By 7:14 a.m., the State Department Operations Center had reached the Federal Security Director for Newark Liberty International Airport, a career TSA executive named Vincent Donato, who had been at his desk for 9 minutes. Vincent Donato had taken the call. He had listened for approximately 90 seconds. He had stood up from his desk. He had walked at the unhurried pace of a man who had spent 26 years in federal aviation security, out of his office and down 2 flights of stairs to the Terminal C priority checkpoint. He had arrived at the door of the secondary screening room at 7:21 a.m. He had not knocked. He had opened the door. He had taken in the situation in approximately 3 seconds. He had registered Officer Brandon Whitaker standing on one side of the metal table with the ambassador's documents in front of him. Ambassador Ngozi Adichie-Brennan standing on the other side of the table with her hands folded in front of her at the level of her waist. Tunde Okeke standing in the doorway behind him, his phone in his hand, his face approximately the color of cold cement. Vincent Donato had said, in the precise enunciation of a senior federal aviation security official, addressing a situation he had immediately understood the dimensions of, Officer Whitaker, step away from the table now. Brandon Whitaker had stepped away from the table. Vincent Donato had picked up the diplomatic passport. He had picked up the UN laissez-passer. He had examined both documents for less than 4 seconds each. He had handed them with both hands back to Ambassador Adichie-Brennan. He had said, Madam Ambassador, on behalf of the Transportation Security Administration, on behalf of the Department of Homeland Security, and on behalf of the United States of America, I apologize. This should not have happened. It will be investigated. The investigation will not be a formality. I would like to escort you, personally, to your gate. May I do that? Ambassador Ngozi Adichie-Brennan looked at Vincent Donato. She looked then at Officer Brandon Whitaker, who was standing approximately 4 feet to Vincent Donato's left, and whose face was, at that moment, doing several things at once. She looked back at Vincent Donato. She said in the same level voice she had used at the checkpoint and at the table, Mr. Donato, I would appreciate the escort to my gate. I would also appreciate, before I leave this room, the noted time of my release. It is now 7:23 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. I was asked to step out of line at 6:47 a.m. I have been detained on the basis of documents which you have just verified in under 4 seconds each for 36 minutes. My flight has departed. The UN Human Rights Council session I was scheduled to chair will begin in 7 hours and 37 minutes. I will not be present for the opening of that session. The session will in consequence be delayed. The delay will be reported. The reason for the delay will be reported. Mr. Donato, do we understand each other? Vincent Donato had said, in the same precise voice, Madam Ambassador, we understand each other. The investigation will begin within the hour. You will hear from me personally before the end of this week. What happened in the next 122 minutes, the additional time that would elapse between the moment Vincent Donato had escorted Ambassador Adichie-Brennan from the secondary screening room to a private lounge in Terminal C, where she had waited for the rescheduling of her travel, and the moment she had finally boarded a noon flight to Geneva via Zurich on a different carrier did not involve further detention. It involved, instead, the precise diplomatic and political machinery that had been activated by Tunde Okeke's first text message at 6:48 a.m., and that, by 9 a.m., was operating across 4 continents, 6 embassies, 3 foreign ministries, 2 cabinet offices, the National Security Council, and the personal calendars of approximately 23 senior officials in 3 governments. The 2 hours had not been spent in detention. They had been spent in the slow and unyielding execution of a diplomatic response that the United States government had. In the 11 minutes between 6:48 a.m. and 6:59 a.m., lost any ability to contain. By 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, the foreign minister of the Republic of Canary had summoned the United States ambassador to Canary to his office in the capital. The summons had been issued in writing on official ministry letterhead and had been delivered by foreign ministry courier to the U.S. Embassy at approximately 2:14 p.m. local time. The summons had requested the U.S. ambassador's attendance at 9 a.m. the following morning, local time, to receive the formal protest of the government of the Republic of Canary regarding the treatment of Her Excellency Ambassador Nosy Adichie Brennan by an officer of the United States Transportation Security Administration at Newark Liberty International Airport on the morning of October 14. The summons had used the formal diplomatic language of démarche. The U.S. ambassador to Canary, a career Foreign Service officer named Eleanor Bishop, who had been in post for 18 months, had read the summons twice. She had cabled Washington at 2:47 p.m. local time. The cable had been classified secret/no foreign. The cable had said in its operative paragraph, Canary MFA response to Adichie Brennan incident is proportionate but firm. Host government expects public acknowledged judgment at the level of Deputy Secretary or higher. Recommend immediate press posture to preclude escalation. By 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, the United States Department of State had issued a written statement of regret. The statement had been drafted by the Bureau of African Affairs, cleared by the Office of the Secretary of State, and released through the State Department's press office. It had named Ambassador Adichie Brennan by name. It had apologized without qualification. It had announced the opening of a full and immediate review of the incident at Newark Liberty International Airport and of the policies and practices that allowed it to occur. It had been reposted on social media by the U.S. Mission to the United Nations and by the U.S. Embassy in Canary City. It had been the lead item on the State Department's afternoon press briefing. By 2 p.m., the United Nations Human Rights Council session in Geneva had been formally delayed 11 hours by the Council President, a Norwegian ambassador named Sigrid Halvorsen, who had announced the delay in a brief statement to the Council that had referenced circumstances affecting the chair's travel that are now the subject of communication between the relevant member states and the United States government. The statement had been delivered in measured, careful language. It had been understood by every diplomat in the room exactly as it had been intended to be understood. The Human Rights Council had moved into informal consultations. The informal consultations had lasted 4 hours. The session had ultimately reconvened with Ambassador Adichie Brennan in the chair at 2 a.m. Geneva time the following day. She had opened the session with a 15-minute statement that had not, by any standard, mentioned the events at Newark Liberty International Airport. The statement had concerned, instead, the agenda item the session had been convened to address, the deteriorating human rights situation in the Sahel. She had read the statement in the same level voice she had used at the secondary screening room. She had received, at the conclusion of her statement, a standing ovation from the Council that had lasted approximately 47 seconds. The ovation had not been customary. It had been, by every diplomat in the room, exactly as it had been intended to be received. Within 72 hours, the formal protest from the Canary Ministry of Foreign Affairs had been delivered to U.S. Ambassador Eleanor Bishop in Canary City. The protest had requested formally appropriate disciplinary action with respect to the officer involved and a structural review of the Transportation Security Administration's practices with respect to diplomatic personnel. Within 10 days, Officer Brandon Whitaker had been formally terminated by the Transportation Security Administration. A second TSA officer who had been working the priority lane that morning and who had observed the detention without intervention had been terminated alongside him. The Federal Security Director for Newark Liberty International Airport, Vincent Donato, had resigned voluntarily within 3 weeks, citing in his resignation letter to the TSA administrator, "The failure of the supervisory structure I led to have identified and corrected the pattern of conduct that culminated in the events of October 14. He had not been asked to resign. The TSA administrator had attempted to dissuade him. He had resigned anyway. The Senate Committee on Foreign Relations had received the closed-door briefing the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs had been preparing for 2 weeks. The Transportation Security Administration had announced 6 months after the incident a new mandatory training module on the recognition and handling of foreign diplomatic credentials, with annual recertification required of every TSA officer in the United States. The module had been developed in consultation with the State Department's Office of Foreign Missions and with input from the diplomatic corps of 17 foreign missions in Washington and New York, including the Republic of Canary. Ambassador Ngozi Adichie-Brennan did not in any public forum in the months that followed refer to the events at Newark Liberty International Airport in detail. She gave one interview to the BBC African Service 4 months after the incident. She had been asked in the interview how she had felt during the 2 hours of her detention. She had thought for a moment. She had said, in the same level voice she had used in the secondary screening room, "I felt what every black woman in an airport feels when she is told that her documents look off. I felt what every black diplomat from a country smaller than the country detaining her feels when the officer in front of her does not, in his immediate assessment of the document in his hand, see a diplomat. I felt what the deputy chief of mission of the West African delegation standing 6 feet behind me felt when he turned his head to track what was happening, because he had had a version of this happen to him in another airport in another year and recognized the moment for what it was. The difference between him and me in that secondary screening room was that I had a chief of staff with 31 text messages already in flight, and he had had nothing. The difference between him and me is the difference between a story that becomes an international incident and a story that does not. There are a great many more of the second kind of story than the first. The work of my discipline is to ensure that the first kind of story creates the conditions under which the second kind of story stops being told. She had paused. The interviewer had not interrupted. What I felt more than anything else was tired. I have been doing this work for 19 years. I am tired, but I am, by some combination of accident and intention, in a position in which my tiredness is a useful thing to carry into the rooms it is carried into. So I carry it, and on the morning I cease to carry it, there will be someone else. There is always someone else. That is the thing about this work, that I am still, after 19 years, occasionally grateful for. There is always, in any room, someone else. The interview aired the following Sunday. The clip of the final 2 paragraphs was shared widely. Ambassador Ngozi Adichie-Brennan did not, in the years that followed, give a second interview of similar prominence. She did not need to. The work had taken on a different shape in the wake of October 14. She continued to do it,